Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts.
Sort of welcome Brezzo back to the studio that he should remind me of one of my classic topics for slagging you with.
Your favourite types of workplace bullying.
Yeah, it was your height in the chair and how he said you looked like one of those kids in the hairdressers that needed the booster seat.
Yeah, well, in fact, I am.
Am I much taller than you now? You see, we can't see because we don't have.
You're absolutely not even close to being as tall as me.
I'm actually very tall.
It's your inflated sense of self leads you to believe you're even close to my height.
Sense of height?
But just a general sense of,
Do you remember I thought I was 5'11" or something?
So this is a true story, right? So we had a medical in work, and obviously your weight and your height is measured as a result. And Nicola Talent's height, and this is probably private medical information, came back as 5'6". And she said, in all honesty, I thought I was 5'9". I've gone around my whole life thinking I was 5'9", and I'm 5'6".
So tall. I was really disappointed. I wanted to
most people overestimate themselves just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah.
But there's some that really, really go for it.
Anyway, you're sitting in a chair there in the studio, and sometimes the chairs are a little bit lower, and you do look funny.
Yeah, well, I may grow more this year anyway as I approach my 5th decade and not giving up.
Do you think that you continue to grow?
I think I could.
Upwards or outwards?
I think you're going to grow in wisdom and height.
Yeah.
I don't think outwards is a possibility.
No. Right. Well, look, anyway, we're not on to slag one another off. We're going to talk about breaking news story this morning. Many people woke up to the fact that there was yet another attempt to land a mother load of cocaine onto Irish shores that appears to have been thwarted. Now, there's been 4 guys arrested, one of whom is from Derry, 2 from Scotland, I think, and 1 Serbian living in the UK.
Yeah.
Anyway, these are before the courts currently. They're in custody.
They're in custody, and the guards have sought an extension to question them, but they haven't been charged with any offence.
Okay.
So, I mean, what we do know is it seems likely, again, this is an intelligence-led operation, that it seems because of the nationality and the details that we know of them, that in all likelihood, these drugs were not destined for the Irish market, and that again Ireland's coast is being used as a convenient place to land drug shipments. Now, obviously, no drugs were recovered.
I think they're gone. Is the suspicion that there won't be drugs recovered in this operation? In other words, they've gone overboard if they were on that ship, and there's unfortunately they. Yeah. And the intelligence, you have to be very, very timely with everything, and everything has to be so accurate to get, to get things as they're. I mean, look, we're talking general because there's people before the courts and in custody on this one. But in general, what's happening is there is more and more attempts to land the mother loads, as they're called. They can be. I mean, I think the MV Matthew load was worth about 150 million. It was the biggest ever cocaine seizure in Ireland. And we'll get on to the MV Matthew in a minute. But basically, there's more and more attempts to land the cocaine, and this is for the European market, into the Irish shoreline. It would be transported from Ireland, but also through the north into Scotland, down to England. And then if it goes any further, the English market itself is enormous, far bigger than ours. And there's the reason for this. It's interesting if you look at it actually, because in around 2022, when this started happening again in Ireland, and we started seeing these massive big shipments and making arrangements to drop off drugs here, it was in the aftermath of the Encro hack, which really sort of one of the big takeaways from it was the weaknesses of the ports of Europe, Rotterdam and Antwerp in particular. And I think in 22 or 23, I was out in Antwerp at the port, and I was talking to our colleague Joris van der Aan. He was talking about all these new measures that were being brought in. They were in particular going to target shipments of bananas and other goods coming in from South America. They were going to search as many of them as they could. They had all sorts of new high-tech X-ray equipment which could beat the drug dealers, equipment which sort of, stops those X-ray things working. They were bringing in new dogs, all sorts of new measures and loads more port staff. They'd also identified a lot of people who were working around and in the ports and who were on the take from the drug gangs and who were able to wave their shipments through with ease. And I think that clampdown on those ports has meant that the drug dealers as always move again. So between 2022 and now, so we saw none of this activity on the Irish shores between 24 and 22.
Yeah.
2014 and 22. So that's a lengthy period not to see anything. And all of a sudden from 22 to now, we have seen at least 4 that we know of, and evidence of others, particularly in Donegal, where those bales floated in, that looked like one of these operations gone awry.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, as you said, there's a couple of reasons for it. It seems that some of the technology is enhancing this type of drop-off as well.
Yeah.
We saw very recently, just before Christmas, a Bulgarian man who was convicted. He had attempted to drop... I think it was £22 million worth, but that could rise to £105 million worth of cocaine.
That's right, because it was pure, the 21 million.
Yeah, and, it was estimated to be worth 5 times on a street level. But again, they were using high-tech trackers. Now, it hadn't actually happened in this case. He hadn't done it because he got suspicious, but they found these high-tech trackers. So that obviously reduces some of the risk for the drug gangs who are using this. But that seems to be the way. They have these motherships, and instead of, they feel the cocaine can be dropped safely in the sea, high-tech trackers that can easily be tracked. And again, in this case, we have these ribs, what's it called? Rigid inflatable boats, basically, that go out and collect it. And again, that reduces the fact that no ship is docking, there's no customs, and the ship can move on, as we saw with the MV Matthew, where it never docked in Ireland. It continued its trek through Europe. Now, why is Ireland such an attractive place? Well, there's a lot of controversy at the moment about NATO and Ireland, and we're certainly not going to take a position or get into that. But you've heard during that controversy about how Ireland's coastline is effectively, it's weak. It's weak. We don't have anything like the navy that other European countries have. We certainly do have some navy ships, and we have monitoring of our coast, but it's far, far less than somewhere like the UK. UK have been traditionally one of the great naval powers across the world. They're a nuclear power. They're a member of NATO, and all of that leads to a lot more of a high technology. Ireland has a long, wide coastline. We're a neutral country. We're not very heavily militarised. And therefore, we're an attractive proposition. Also, once you get drugs into Ireland, while obviously there's customs between Ireland and the UK, it's effectively, by the standards of these things, it's quite because of the tradition of free travel between the two areas, it's probably a relatively low level. And of course, you can drive across the border and, They
also break it up. The minute they land that mother load, which is, say, for example, 20 million pure cocaine, they'll break that up into 20 packages of 1 million pure cocaine, and they start to transport it. So it's like having a glass ball, and that is your mother load, and you drop it on the ground, and it's sort of like splinters into so many different pieces.
Yeah.
And the transport then makes, you've less of a risk.
Yeah.
Because you're lessening every time you break it down further, even if there is a seizure, it's a far smaller seizure. It's interesting you say that about our coastline, and I think we have 3,500 kilometres of coastline and so many different little coves and little, harbours and working ports and deep sea ports and everything all around it. But in around sort of 2000s, between sort of 2000, 2008, 2009, when there was quite a bit of this happening in Ireland, there was calls at that stage, political calls for Europe to help.
Yeah.
That we just did not have the resources, and these drugs were bound for Europe, they're bound for the UK, and we needed help. Now, politically, how do you bring other countries' ships, naval ships into your waters and all the rest of it? But they were actually going to Europe then, and they were requesting help, and they were requesting European funding along this. Now, of course, obviously, because we're an island and because of all those, ports and coves and all the rest of it we have a very vibrant fishing industry
Yeah.
and sort of labourers who work on boats and all the rest of it vulnerable in these jobs because, many of them see this as being a quick buck. You're taking a gamble, you're taking a risk that you go out to sea one night, after midnight in the dark and you pick up a few bales of cocaine. If you land them safely, securely, nobody knows, you're probably going to have the biggest payday of your life. The fishing industry seems to be a difficult one to be involved in.
Yeah, I mean, the fishing industry has come under huge pressure, not least Brexit has had an impact. Other European countries fishing in our waters. So some of the traditional communities, particularly actually along the West Coast, have been deeply impacted. And when you have people struggling, there is always people who will seek to take advantage of that and corrupt people. But the reality is that with any of these shipments that we're talking about, while you're going to have drug dealers and middlemen and money men involved in the drugs business, you need trained professionals as well. So that is an essential part of it.
Like even the rib operators, that seems to be quite a skilled job.
Yeah.
I mean, Martin Wandon, who you remember, who was released recently from prison, was caught up in that Lucky Day shipment in 2007, which was the then biggest cocaine. That was the one we've spoken about a few times, that the weather basically upended the operation. He had gone out in a rib to meet the catamaran, the Lucky Day. The drugs had been successfully transported, but it was a stormy night and there was a mix-up of petrol and diesel in the engines and his boat basically cut out, started to sink, and he ended up clinging to a bale of cocaine. So there was a bit of bad luck with that.
Yeah.
Had that not happened, they probably would have landed, because he was a very skilled boatsman.
Yeah.
And he would have landed the drugs on the coast. You take the MV Matthew.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened there? If we just look back on that, the MV Matthew left Caracas and sailed along Venezuela.
Yeah.
Dropped her anchor off Guyana
for
2 weeks, which would be that's really probably where the boat was loaded with the cocaine. It is a popular loading point for the South American drug cartels. She crossed the Atlantic. At one point, they knew that she slowed near the Canary Islands and a ship sort of lurked nearby. Was never sort of proved, but it was suspected that half the load maybe was let off there. And then in September, she came into the Irish waters and went past the Wicklow coast, looked as if she was heading for Belfast, where there is a deep sea port up there. And then she sort of slowed down, turned around, reported engine difficulty, went to pull into Cork, didn't. Clearly on the boat, you'd imagine the operation was seemingly somehow, I mean, there was suspicious activity that alerted the Irish Coast Guard, but they were working anyway on intelligence there. At the same time, there was another fishing trawler boat had been bought in Wexford, and it went out to meet the boat, but there was a storm again.
Yeah.
So there was bad luck with the weather, and that boat had to be actually rescued. And I think the 7 people before the courts in relation to that, it's an ongoing case. They're before the Special Criminal Court now.
Yeah.
Usually what you see is, so there's a bit of bad luck there with both of those. You'd wonder how much stuff is actually coming in then.
Yeah, I mean, it's the estimate, I think it was said to us before, was 10% of it is caught. I mean, so if you look at some of those seizures, we've had record seizures again this year of cocaine, but we've also had a number of these sort of deep sea seizures. So if you look at only 10% of them have been caught, you're talking a huge amount of money, and there's probably, because of the people that are involved, you hear that old saying, intelligence-led operation. Obviously, presumably a lot of that is either digital or human-related intelligence. But, there must be huge amounts of it just get through. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Sure.
And if you look at the Bulgarian case just before, a guy called Kayman Petkov, when you hear he was basically...
We have done a proper podcast on him, which we will release later in the week. But
just in the general sense, he was an ordinary ship's electrician.
Yeah.
And he made use of the fact there were some empty cabins, and he stored this £21 million worth of cocaine, and he was due to drop it off in the sea, and off he goes. Now, he was being offered, according to him, €150,000 for that. So really, that's a huge amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
That's somebody with no convictions, and I don't think there was any suggestion he had a suspected history of this. He certainly claimed it was his first time. But these are the people that these drug gangs have to get at. Again, in that case, there seems to have been encrypted phones.
Mm-hmm.
Again, in this case, certainly it was said at a press conference in this most recent case in Kerry that encrypted phones are a factor in this case. But again, who
doesn't have encrypted phones? They're all still using them despite the hacks and
of course that's.
But the other thing is, I suppose, to point out, we've spoken about the fishing industry here being a difficult one maybe to be trying to earn your living out of, but actually a lot of people that end up before the courts here in relation to these, because usually those that are caught are the ones, the workers really, they're not the kingpins. I mean, the MV Matthew has been, there's a variety of people, foreign nationals before the courts, including Iranians.
Yeah.
And that tonnage on that MV Matthew is suspected of being Kinahan product, of course.
Yes.
They had an investment in it. But a lot of those people that do take those high risks, which is bringing the drugs in or crewing those boats, are foreign nationals.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are recruited in countries certainly poorer than ours by drug gangs. And they're probably working in that industry, they're working on ships. They can be bribed. Some of them have told stories in court in their defence about being threatened, about being, I remember there was one story of a guy, and I wish I could pull his name out. Where somewhere in my head there is his name, but he'd had the most unlucky story you could ever imagine. He was living out in some beautiful island in the Caribbean. His wife or his partner had got cancer. He hadn't the money to get her treated, and there was obviously no healthcare such as there was here. I'm sure it was lovely to live in the beauty of the island, but when it came to the kind of the practicalities of it wasn't great. So he had this boat, and he used to go out and do pleasure cruises and try and make money, and he was getting along okay. And the next thing, there was a storm and the boat was destroyed. And very quickly he sort of spiraled into this place. At least this was his story to the courts, that he ended up taking on a job which he thought was going to solve all his problems. He think he was going to get paid 100,000 or something, which I'm sure was a huge amount of money in this place where he was living. And it was just one journey across the Atlantic. And of course that was the one he was caught on. And he ended up in jail here in Ireland. There was another guy who, when he was caught here, his girlfriend and child had stowed away with them on the boat carrying the drugs, because he told the courts he was afraid to leave her behind. He was being threatened by drug gangs. So you have all these very kind of colourful,
and
dramatic stories that these, but in the end of the day, most of them that are caught are at the bottom of the ladder, and they'd serve very long sentences.
Huge sentences, because it's not seen as it's seen as profiteering by the court. Certainly in Ireland, people are doing it to make money. There is no other justification. They're not suffering from addiction, or they're not under pressure within the community. A lot of these drug shipments, we've seen that some of the Balkans mafias, a lot of them based in sort of Albania or the former Yugoslavia states, have become heavily involved in the logistics of the movement of drugs, including the Dino and Tito cartel, who were associated with the Kinahans. And that was one of their specialities, which was the logistics of it. So you have a lot of Eastern European sailors who have been corrupted and offered money. Obviously, some of them coming from very poor circumstances. So again, there is that connection in this case, we believe. But again, it's
Now, I suppose point out as well, in Ireland, the thing is, when those people are caught up in a failed operation and the drugs are gone, we can still bring charges, can't we, for facilitating organised crime gangs?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen those.
This is under the gangland legislation, those charges.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to, I suppose.
It's not black and white here as it can be in other countries.
No, it's not as black and white. It's not as black and white here as you used to have to be caught red-handed, effectively. But absolutely, the encrypted phones have proven that facilitation of criminal organisations is a case that can be made in Irish courts, and made very successfully. If you can be tied to electronic communication showing that there was a criminal conspiracy, if that can be connected in to the satisfaction of the court. You can be done without finding drugs, or in other cases we've had weapons or murder plots without anybody being close to any scenes. You can still be done. So again, the guards have successfully brought these cases again and again. And yeah, obviously there's been no drugs seized in this case, but the men have been arrested on suspicion of facilitating a criminal organisation.
It just seems as if there's so many more men, and not like these that are in custody we're talking about, but those have already been convicted in other operations similar to this. There seems to be a never-ending supply of them.
There is.
Willing to take that chance for that, windfall of money.
Yeah, I mean, it's driven, it's huge amounts of money.
Do you think lessons, do you know the way you say it, kind of like, the sentences are fairly hefty in Ireland. In the end of the day, the guys who are actually making the proper money out of this, people at the top of the tree who've invested, whose product is on those ships, they don't really care.
They don't care.
Or somebody's caught. They just chance their arm getting it in. And, Portugal and Spain too are very much experiencing the same kind of levels of this stuff as we are.
They are. And Australia, amazingly, has been also something that's seen these types of drug importations again and again. And we've had constant features of bales of cocaine washing up on the Australian shore. Really interesting again, because obviously that's another shipping route coming from South America maybe to Asia, and it's possible to drop something off a massive coastline. Of course, Australia, I mean, an absolutely huge country with, a relatively small population to its size. So that's obviously been another point. But we have seen traditionally in the Netherlands and in Belgium that the ports were really the point of
entry
focus.
Point, exactly. So the cocaine cowboys are back on the high seas.
Yeah.
And
Ireland's cocaine coast is popular as ever.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.